We are going to talk a little bit about our year in hate and extremism. This is a report on the state of the hard right in the United States, the authoritarian movements, the hate movement, the anti-government movement. We've been putting together this report for 50 years. It is probably the longest longitudinal report on such a movement in the world. And we hope that it's reflective and it can be used as a tool by communities to help inform strategy, to back them up. And I'm going to share just a few things about general overall, and then turn it to my colleagues to dig deep into some of the topics that you all are working on. In 2022, I think we saw a real shift from a really nationally focused hard right movement that was really focused in DC, right? I mean, we had experienced January 6th insurrection, and there was a real shift in strategy by the hard right to refocus on our communities on the local level, on Main Street America. And we really saw that the fingerprints of this movement was everywhere in people's lives, as you all deeply know, in their homes, in their schools, but in their doctor's offices, in the libraries, in our bars, restaurants, in the LGBTQ community centers, all across those spaces that really engage in people's everyday life. And that means that there was this attempt to really insert themselves in places where they thought that they could limit the rights of people more easily because folks maybe weren't watching, or because they had the ability to make waves with a few folks or a few people. And this really disrupted people's ability to participate in democracy. What we documented was the institutional infrastructure of the organized groups in our country, as well as their strategies, as well as their activities and the big themes. So in terms of like group numbers, something we're known for, so I'll share that we documented 523 hate groups, these groups that like explicitly vilify folks for their immutable characteristics or an identity that they are part of or perceived to be part of. And this includes, everything from things you're more familiar with, like the Klan, but also anti-LGBTQ groups and neo-Nazi groups, anti-immigrant groups, etc. And also 702 anti-government groups. And this is, everything from the militias to the conspiracy propagandists to those constitutional sheriffs that you may have heard of. Trend-wise, hate group trends really, have fluctuated over time. We actually saw a slight decrease this last year. We think that's in part because of not having that sort of microphone and megaphone of the presidency to organize behind them and to really bolster their efforts. And instead, we saw kind of, I think, a reflection of something we expected, which is, with the Democratic federal administration, a really pushback on government and the role of government, and to be able to support our lives and to, create that infrastructure. And so we saw, a dramatic rise in the number of anti-government groups this last year. I think that, one of the most important things to note is that, by uncovering the strategies and tactics of this movement, we're able to inform our work. And I think a key example that I'll share before I turn to my colleague is that, we were able to see a real shift in what the groups that were involved in January 6th most directly and were held accountable by law enforcement, by Congress, by the media, the public, that the impact on those groups was really quite different depending on their structure and who they were recruiting. So we saw a dramatic decrease in the number of Oath Keeper chapters, the militia group that had organized since 2009. Just 3 years earlier, they had 77 chapters in the country. They went to 25 and then 5 in 2022. And that's because they were recruiting amongst people who wanted to think of themselves as respectable members of society. And they had a structure that was really a more singular leader. So that accountability measures really impacted them. On the other side, we saw Proud Boys, a group that was recruiting amongst people who were sort of happy to be on the margins, that didn't really care about being labeled with that criminality. And in fact, we're proud of it. And so we actually saw a real stabilization, and a slight increase of 2 chapters to, 78 chapters of Proud Boys in the US. So one of the things we're pointing out too is that the way we address these groups, the way we address the movement as a whole and its impact, it really should depend on how they organize and what's going to impact them the most. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn over to my colleague, Maya Henson-Carey, who's going to talk about one of the most impactful movements of 2022, something you all are very familiar with. Maya, I'll let you go and I can show a slide or two for you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. As Rachel just noted, we have monitored a noticeable shift with extremism moving into the mainstream in our everyday lives. An example of this can be seen in groups that maintain anti-government ideals that have been using radical extremist tactics to attack diverse students and inclusive education. At SPLC, we are referring to these groups as anti-student inclusion groups, and they fall under our anti-government designation. So in our recently released Year in Hate and Extremism and our recently updated hate map, we have 12 anti-student inclusion groups that we have designated as anti-government, along with their nationwide chapters. So these include Moms for Liberty, which has quickly become one of the largest and most recognized groups in this movement, Parents Defending Education, a nationwide group that has filed a number of lawsuits against schools that have affinity groups for minority and LGBTQ plus students, and No Left Turn in Education, which has been heavily involved in book bans, especially in Florida. So these anti-student inclusion groups really sprang up in the past few years, mostly due to opposition to COVID-19 mask and vaccine mandates, and inclusive education. A common narrative that they push is that public schools and public educators are attempting to indoctrinate and sexualize children and gain influence through this radical Marxist agenda. So they push this narrative in a number of ways. They have been working to ban critical race theory, both at the state and the school level. There have been considerable efforts to ban instructional materials and books that they don't agree with. And most of these have to do with LGBTQ plus community members or pertain to people of color. They also combat LGBTQ plus acceptance in schools. So the use of pronouns, gender affirming care. We noticed a spike in the term groomer being used to label teachers and librarians that they feel are sexualizing children through books and curriculum. And we actually saw teachers and educators being doxxed and verbally attacked and had threats of physical violence against them. And finally, these groups have been calling for the abolition of the Department of Education, both at the federal and the state level. I think one key takeaway is that SPLC polling corresponds with research conducted by other national organizations like Brookings and CBS and NBC News that say that these groups are really a reactionary minority. Most parents and citizens and students don't agree with the narratives that they are pushing. Most people actually agree with the accurate teaching of history and trusting educators and administrators to set the curriculum in school. But these anti-student inclusion groups have really been successful in leveraging their ties and relationships with political officials and big name media personalities and also extremist groups. So they have been put in a place where they can make these sweeping changes for the majority of students when they are actually just a reactionary minority. I'll end by highlighting that there are groups like Red, Wine, and Blue. And in our Year in Hate and Extremism, we featured Support Our Schools. And I think I saw Paulina Testerman, one of their co-directors, on the call tonight. And these groups have not only formed to counteract these anti-student inclusion groups, but they also have formed to represent the best interests of all parents and all students, not just a very small demographic. And now I'll hand it off to my colleague, RG.
Thanks, Maya. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the anti-LGBTQ component of this movement. So just a little history. There is a long history of attempting to ban LGBTQ topics and people from public spaces, including educational spaces. It in fact goes back pretty far in terms of just public opinion studies, which is something that I've specialized in my career. But public opinion polling in the United States, for example, starting asking people whether they supported gay and lesbian teachers or gay and lesbian themed books in public libraries since the 1970s. And those all trend positively, by the way. There's lots of support out there for both of those things in the contemporary population. But the contemporary campaigns to prevent LGBTQ teachers from, say, holding public school jobs and banning LGBTQ books has roots in that same period of time when a lot of activists attempted to dismantle civil rights protections for LGBTQ people through popular voting, like initiatives and referenda. So some examples you might have heard of: Anita Bryant's campaign founded a group called Save Our Children, right, which might sound a little familiar. Worked to repeal protections across the country throughout the 1970s. California famously defeated something called the Briggs Initiative in 1978, which was one of the first major attempts to prohibit LGBTQ people from holding jobs like being a teacher, right? Those campaigns have very similar themes to the contemporary efforts to ban LGBTQ topics in schools. Maya mentioned some, but I would like to share just a couple of others. Contemporary campaigns sometimes focus on prohibiting schools or sometimes focus on censoring sex education curriculum. Sometimes they focus on prohibiting the teaching of divisive concepts, defined typically as topics that create division or define one group as oppressed. They censor sometimes discussions of topics deemed inappropriate or obscene through the use of what's called Don't Say Gay or trans laws. There are also laws to specifically ban trans students from competing in school sports. Some laws potentially require teachers to out LGBTQ students, and some of these laws extend into other educational spaces like libraries and higher education institutions. So it's not just, say elementary schools where these policies have effect. The campaigns are part of a broader anti-democratic strategy, I would say, to limit the benefits of civil society to certain groups by excluding others from being able to fully utilize public spaces. As Maya mentioned, these political attacks on public education also fit within a campaign to dismantle public education, but also to sow distrust in our public institutions, right? The things that are supposed to keep us, that are supposed to work for all of us. The campaigns often use conspiratorial rhetoric. For example, they might say that schools or teachers are attempting to indoctrinate or even turn kids LGBTQ. They'll also use pseudoscientific ideas, like the idea that LGBTQ identity spreads through social contagion. So if you hear that phrase, that's probably a good indicator of support for one of these kinds of policies. That one typically is taken to mean that any kind of affirmation of LGBTQ people equates to a danger to kids because it's a sign of indoctrination. And I think it's interesting to also point out that proponents often claim to protect kids, but they're actually creating even more hostile places, especially in public places that are supposed to, again, serve everyone. And I'll also say that the sort of effect, in terms of the effect of these kinds of policies and campaigns, distrust of public institutions gets amplified by confusion. And so when it's an open question about what books are allowed or what topics you can or can't address, it contributes to self-censorship, sort of an unwillingness to initiate conversations out of fear. And so even if the laws or policies get overturned, there's a chilling effect that still exists. And it maintains a high amount of danger for suppressing, right, continuing the suppression of LGBTQ folks. So I'll stop there so then we have time for questions and turn it over to my colleague, Jeff.
So here I want to talk really about how white power groups use education to network and as a way to infiltrate more legitimate organizations and get really narrow into what I see day to day. I document groups that are along the kind of the frame of white nationalism, that they dip into neo-Nazism. And since the pandemic, many of these groups have been stressing homeschooling and building homeschooling networks where they share curriculum and use these spaces as a way to kind of strategize how to bring their ideas, not just on education, but race generally, into more mainstream or legitimate homeschooling networks. So before I get down into it, I just want to mention that the rhetoric that I'm seeing here involving these homeschool networks and the ideas that these white power groups have on education are really baked into the fabric of this country and how we think of education and what we're trying to move past, right? And we're also seeing in this rhetoric around homeschooling, we can see kind of ties that more legitimate groups like Moms for Liberty are sanitizing these messages. So I'll go through a couple of groups as kind of representative examples of how they're talking about education and how they're mainstreaming, how they're using this to mainstream their beliefs. I'll start with National Justice Party, NJP, and Evergreen, which are closely associated, and they started what's known as the Dissident Homeschool Network. Both NJP and Evergreen are what we designate as white nationalist groups. These are groups that really want to create their own kind of geographical, space. They want to create an ethno-state, and they focus their hatred on the alleged inferiority of non-white persons. The Dissident Homeschool Network spans, at least as far as I can tell, into Tennessee, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky. I've also seen people in Florida as well as Georgia enter into these spaces. And if I could, since I have you here, if I could really break down kind of like an aside, members of NJP, the National Justice Party, are also known to train at a private gym above Lewis Country Store in Nashville, Tennessee. And when I reported on this in early June, I found this, it was the existence of this gym, how it's being used to network as a space to network by these white nationalist groups. The store owner, Brad Lewis, has been seething about us, has been seething about the SPLC and myself at least 50 times online. And he's also, believe it or not, has written 3 anti-Semitic poems about me. So just to give you an idea of like the people we're dealing with and the people in these movements who just seemingly cannot take an L and move on, all right? So back to the Dissident Homeschool Network. It's basically just a chat and a channel on this alt-tech platform called Telegram. And it's used by parents basically involved with these hate groups. There's about 300 members or so. Most of them were not active, but they would share stories of how to motivate their children, organize impactful white supremacist curriculum. And then also in these chat rooms, participants mocked vaccines, mocked COVID. They shared racist and anti-Semitic imagery and strategized on how to bring their message to more legitimate groups, either in real life or on Facebook, homeschooling groups. So they would identify these groups. They would talk about how to kind of talk about their beliefs with so-called normies, which is their phrase for like MAGA folks and Christian conservatives. The organizers of the Dissident Homeschool Network also produced their own lesson plans. They produced at least about 20 lesson plans so far. And all of their lesson plans start with an image of a young white Aryan woman who was used by Nazi propagandists in the 30s and early 40s. One representative example of their lesson plan focuses on the topic of Thanksgiving. In the preface on the lesson, the author states, the main thing, quote, the main thing is that we don't expose our kids to the mainstream rainbow story of Thanksgiving that is taught in, quote, current day programming. The author then uses racial slurs and ends the preface by talking about how and what this lesson will not teach kids. And this section is filled with racial slurs. The bulk of the lesson on Thanksgiving lays out a brief history of the Pilgrims and outlines their alleged cultural superiority. This is an old story that we've seen in classrooms for decades. White Europeans are represented as hardworking, focused on community building, and specifically acclimated to harsh conditions. They come across as tough but reasonable. The authors represent the so-called New World. The Pilgrims found, quote, as an untapped resource. Native folks are represented as either non-existent or a violent threat due to their, quote, primitive nature. The lesson ends by asking students to reflect on what they learned. Quote, take time to appreciate who is sitting and standing next to you, who you can rely on, who helped mom and dad get that new project started, who are the same people, who are the people you can be useful around and count on for support. Next, I'll just briefly run through the AOSTRU folk assembly, which also has a fairly popular homeschooling network, which is called the Homeschool Academy. And it's mainly a website that offers supporters curriculum and tips, but they're seeking to build a brick and mortar institution in a tract of land that they purchased in Jackson County, Tennessee. My colleagues uncovered this purchase and have been reporting and reported on it. And according to the group, the AFA's leaders, this land is anticipated to be the group's corporate and spiritual headquarters. So they plan on building a temple, they plan on building a school. And, to give you a sense of what the school is going to be about, the website really is a good example. The website states, quote, we want to teach your child about our wonderful Aryan people and our stories. And then lastly, just quickly, not to be too redundant, but there's another group in Arizona that is also a part of the hate group movement. It's called the School of the West. And what's really shocking and kind of outrageous about this group, it's a website, it's a guy who was a former teacher, and he's on these far-right racist podcasts trying to build an ethno-state, and he sees himself as like the intellectual kind of founder of the education movement for this ethno-state. And he's a former teacher in it's a very diverse community in Arizona, primarily full of Navajo and Latinx students. And he goes on podcasts routinely to talk about his teaching experiences. And I don't want to quote him necessarily, but he talks about it as like him being on the front lines of cultural change. He's like really seeing himself as like a warrior to protect white European culture. And every time I kind of dig into this guy, I cringe. I mean, how many other folks are out there with these ideas and the increasing popularity of these ideas? So to end, I just want to give two quick takeaways. Just raising awareness. These groups are small, they're dispersed, but they are actively trying to go into these more legitimate spaces. And we can see, particularly in this lesson on Thanksgiving, how their rhetoric is being championed and sanitized by groups like Moms for Liberty. So I'll move it on now to my colleague, Michael Lieberman.
Hi, everyone. So this perhaps is not the most upbeat briefing that Red, Wine, and Blue has ever held. But what are we doing about this, and what can you do about this? I think we feel a special responsibility at SPLC when we identify problems to try and make suggestions on what can be done about it. Our Year in Hate and Extremism report contains a number of policy recommendations. I'm just going to outline a couple for you. First, accountability. The planners and perpetrators of the January 6th insurrection and those who financed and inspired them to act must be held accountable.
Pardon me, Michael. Rachel, we can't see your screen. It's black. Sorry.
I'll let Michael continue, and I'll fix it while you're talking, Michael. Go for it.
We are hoping that the planners, perpetrators, those who inspired them to act on January 6th will be held accountable with serious consequences. And for local officials, it's impossible to overstate the importance of elected officials, business leaders, community leaders, using their public platforms to condemn and act against political violence, against racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of bigotry when they occur. Second, data drives policy. The FBI has been collecting hate crime policy from the nation's 18,000 police departments for the past 30 years. The most recent data is from 2021 and documents the highest level of hate crimes ever recorded, the highest number of race-based crimes, the highest number of anti-Hispanic crimes, the highest number of anti-AAPI crimes, the highest number of anti-trans crimes. Yet there are thousands of agencies, maybe you live in one of them, in one of those jurisdictions, that did not report any hate crime data to the FBI. And about 80% of those that theoretically, quote, participated in the FBI's Hate Crime Statistics Act reported zero, affirmatively reported zero hate crimes, including dozens of cities over 100,000 in population. So it's time to make hate crime data collection mandatory or to condition federal funding on credible reporting. And we need better data on political violence, on white supremacy and policing in the military, on extremist content online, and better disclosure about who's paying for online political initiatives and political advertisements. Finally, it's crucially important to pick up where Maya Carey ended, which is we need to teach truth. We need to know that several states, way too many, and particularly in the South, are currently passing laws restricting teaching about racism and other painful truths about our nation's history. This group knows that better than almost anyone else. Concealing the truth about our history does not protect our youth. It makes them susceptible to misinformation and fails to equip them with the digital literacy and thinking skills and education they need to navigate this new age where disinformation and manipulation are spreading on the internet. So much more needs to be done to teach young people the unvarnished truth about American history, both the good and the bad, so that we can learn lessons from the past to shape a better future. And you should know that we are working and would welcome your assistance in urging the Department of Education to do everything they can do, enforce federal laws like Title IX and Title VI, and to make resources available on inclusive education, on LGBTQ students and youth and their conditions, and importantly, supporting diversity in all of its forms. Julie, let me turn it over to you after, again, thanking everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks for letting us do this briefing with you. Julie, turn it back over to you if we have time for questions.
Yes, we'll do questions in just a moment. First, we're going to hear from Amanda, who is one of my coworkers. And I'm looking for, can somebody spotlight her? I don't know what happened to my ability to do that. And spotlight me too, please. So Amanda, tell us what's going on, just briefly where you are, and because I hear that you're in a very rural area.
Well, I am in Pike County, Pennsylvania. It's in the Pocono Mountains, and it is a really beautiful area. We found out when I moved here 13 years ago, I really loved the hiking and the waterfalls and everything the Poconos has to offer. And then I found out that this, they're a gun cult. It's called the Rod of Iron. It's run by Sean Moon, was living here. And they were like going to, this was a few weeks after Parkland had happened. And I was really involved in gun advocacy. I still am. And they were blessing AR-15s about it wasn't even a mile from the school. The school district had to shut down. And I was blown away how we were just allowing this small minority to kind of take over. They worked really hard to make us a sanctuary county, Second Amendment sanctuary county. Then where it got really hard for us here was when it got really hard for probably the majority of the people on the call was during COVID. We were in schools, and Sean Moon came to our school board meeting and brought his church with him. And we were watching online, and that was the first time I felt really like where I just didn't know what to do anymore. It was the height of COVID. They weren't wearing masks. There was probably 100 of them with this dangerous leader. And this, I just really felt like maybe this is what my community wanted. And then I started to look into the group more, and following the SPLC, had some information on them, and Vice had done a documentary on them. We know that there's Proud Boys here. On Mother's Day, I had to climb the mountain across the street from my son's school and take down a Proud Boys banner. The group also, Rod of Iron also attracts Oath Keepers, Patriot Front, No Left Turn, and they're my neighbors. There are people, this past election, they had someone run for every available seat in the county. It was a really scary time.
That sounds horrible. Absolutely horrible. So now we know that you literally climbed the mountain to take down the banner. What other kinds of things have you done to fight back?
So the first thing I did was, luckily I found Red Wine and Blue. And I learned how to organize. And I did not do this alone. I have a lot of friends on this call tonight who have been with me every step of the way. And we decided we were not going to let them be the only voice in the room anymore. And we just started talking to everyone we knew about, like, do you know who they are? And so many people didn't know who they are. They just thought they were like really like, oh, yeah, we support the Second Amendment too. But it was much more, and much more the hateful LGBTQ plus rhetoric, the hateful anti-Semitic rhetoric, that they were protesting through town during Stop the Steal. It was getting really dangerous. So we let everyone we know. We wrote letters to the editor. We called our friends. We had meetings around this topic, and we are still doing this. This is something that's ongoing, because we have to consistently let everyone know that this kind of hate is not allowed or okay where we live here. And the more people that stay silent, the more it grows, and it grows so quickly.
Sounds like it's almost like a cancer in a lot of ways, because
I say that all the time.
If like left to fester, it grows.
Yep, and if the best way to treat it is early detection. Know everything you can, get organized before it happens. If they're not in your school district, they're coming. So get ready, get prepared, get your group together, and they will become some of the best people, because we're just in this boat together. Like we have security at my kids' schools or proms during this time of heightened, like if we go to a board meeting and they will block us from leaving the entrance, or I get a text message that's from a random number that's threatening, then they will send security. Like security was at my son's prom, like to make it's scary, but it is also rewarding to know that they are not going to win here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got a lot of questions that folks have asked in the chat for our guests tonight. Are there any last words that you have for folks before I start going into those?
I would definitely say, if it is not happening in your district, especially with the extremism in school, just start getting prepared now, because it will happen. And if it doesn't, then help the people that have been fighting these fights. And we can't let hate win. We're the majority. They are just more vocal than we are. And once you start wearing your pride pin or your Black Lives Matter shirt, you're going to see more of them in your community. And it gives other people courage to speak out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you, Julie.
And let's see, let's take me off the spotlight too. So I'm just going to put some questions out there, and Michael and team, I don't know who wants to answer, but we had quite a few good ones here in the chat. One thing that people consistently kept asking was, how do you find out about the groups in your area? And so I know that it got put in the chat a couple of times, but if somebody could just, real briefly explain that.
Thanks so much for the question. Thanks for having us. So we do have an interactive map on our website, and that I'll drop the link again. Oh, thanks so much, Maya. Yeah, and you can look by kind of the ideas, the different sub-movements, and you can also look by geography. The other thing is, and we'll share this as well, but Jeff works on an incredible project of tracking incidents of like flyers and banner drops and those sort of things. And then we also have a tip line, because there's many of us, but not enough, because unfortunately we're up against a lot. So really at the end of the day, communities know exactly what's happening to them. Y'all know the best, y'all know the most, right? And so we can put the pieces together. We can put it in a big puzzle. We can try to say how it's connected and give some background, but you all really provide so much of the foundational information about what's going on. And then just like Amanda, how you're pushing back and winning.
So in the very beginning, when someone had mentioned constitutional sheriffs, can somebody briefly just say, like, who are they and what's that about?
Sure. So constitutional sheriffs movement is part of the anti-government militia movement. And essentially, it's just a really old idea that is trying to assert power through the use of local elected law enforcement. And they use this very obscure ideas about sheriff being the highest elected law enforcement in the land to be able to push really extremist ideas that are often anti-federal government. They're about tyrannical one world government conspiracies. But in recent years, we've seen some really concerning activities that are targeting immigrant communities, aligning with anti-LGBTQ activists. In this case, aligning sometimes with Moms for Liberty and trying to say they're going to arrest librarians. And then I think, at their root, we know that constitutional sheriffs movement is also very much tied to the history of using these local law enforcement agencies to police Black and brown bodies. This is a deep history in the South, right? And the history of law enforcement going after African-American people during the slavery era, post-slavery, during Jim Crow, as well as against Indigenous people, particularly in the West. And so it's a really awful movement. We also saw a real push to attack our right to vote by some of these constitutional sheriffs in the last 2 years. So we have what we call an ideology file on, like, what are these ideas, who are the players, and I can drop that in the chat as well.
So, and I must have missed this because I thought you did, but there was a question, why not label Moms for Liberty a hate group?
Maya, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. I think, I'll start by saying that, we have definitions for what a hate group is, what an anti-government group is, and, those and other frequently asked questions are on our website. So our definition of an anti-government group is a group that really believes that the federal government is tyrannical, and they push that narrative by really pushing out conspiracy propaganda. So an overarching theme of these anti-student inclusion groups is the theory that, public education, public educators are attempting to indoctrinate and sexualize children through this radical Marxist agenda. Some of their tactics to push this narrative out are hateful, the attacks on LGBTQ plus students, book bans, the attacks on inclusive curriculum, but at their core, their real true narrative is that public education is really indoctrinating kids. And I think that was really the important thing that we looked at was what is their core message that they're trying to get out, even though they're using these hateful tactics.
Okay. So there are several questions that have been asked about how do you stop either radical board of education members, or once they're, you know, in your community or school, you know, what's the best way to stop them? And then the other one is, how do you report them? So, you know, how do you guys get this information, or how do you want folks to get this information to you? And then what are some things that they can do to kind of, you know, fight back?
Mike, are you interested in taking kind of from the policy piece of this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is that we at SPLC are really a First Amendment embracing and believing organization. We use our First Amendment rights to speak back and speak out against these groups, defining them as we do as anti-government groups or hate groups. That's a really important thing. And I think that's really important for communities as well to be able to use their own First Amendment rights to be able to speak back. I think in terms of responding and how you report them in, we have, Rachel, if you want to talk about the way that we have on our website, a way to report groups that folks might think are crossing the line from First Amendment protected speech, objectionable it may be, to actual extremist or threatening or harassing activity. I think that would be important to be able to highlight as well.
Yeah, I just dropped our website where our tip is, and I've put my email in a few times. You can reach out personally too. But I do think that the reality is, you know, we're going to do our jobs as communities together to hold individuals and groups accountable when they're harming our communities. And that means you all getting together and speaking out, but it also means using sort of our ability at SPLC with this national kind of voice that we have. So absolutely, you know, share with us. But I do think that it's really important to report to your government officials and the local level. It's important to email your mayor. It is important to reach out and call law enforcement if there's a threat, because the reality is if we want those institutions, those are our democratic institutions, right? Our little d democracy institutions. Like if we want them to work for us, we actually have to call on them to work for us. And it's very frustrating because a lot of times I saw folks in the chat say, and I've been in that position because I worked on the ground for, you know, it's 15 years, you report and they just say, I can't do anything about it. But the reality is they know what the community is concerned about if we are saying it again and again. And it is like, gets old to make that call, like send that email, but they have to know, right? Like they have to know that what we want, because we all know that the groups that we've been talking about here today, they are emailing all the time. They are not afraid to pick up that phone, right? Like I want to be like the progressive Karen, you know, like calling about the white nationalists. And so I think that like we got to do it. We have to say it, and it's a lot of work. And I think there are some of these groups who are absolutely not just violent in their rhetoric and violent in the way they capture our institutions and harm us through removal of rights, but they're also actually like violent in their physical activities. And absolutely, there's been partnerships between Proud Boys and Moms for Liberty, stand outside of drag shows, right? And so if that's also the case, then there's a real reason, an immediate reason to tell your government officials. And so make those calls. Some of the groups Jeff was talking about fit in that category. Like there's serious concern.
So I'm glad, Michael, that you brought up the First Amendment, because someone asked the question, are they crossing the line from free speech to illegality?
So the question, of course, is whether there are threats and intimidation and harassment. Those things are not protected speech. And if you are being subjected to individual threats, intimidation, harassment, then you need to speak up and speak out exactly as Rachel said, which is to hold our elected officials accountable. And I think it's also not just speech that is directed to you, but speech that you hear in your communities in exactly the same way that we and many others, I'm sure on this Zoom as well, are trying to hold the January 6th perpetrators and those who inspired them accountable. We want to hold our elected officials, our local community leaders accountable for anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, homophobia that is happening in our communities, and urge them to speak out. That is the right thing to do. I will tell you that when we come up with action agendas in the aftermath of something really bad that happens in a community, one of the most important things is to have leaders of the community condemn what has happened, speak out against what has happened, and that can happen in every community across the country.
So, and I've seen a couple of people actually put in the chat that they live in areas where their elected officials are members of these groups, or they are supportive of these groups. So when that happens, what's the recourse for that? What can someone do if they have folks that are not going to listen because they, quite frankly, are a part of these groups?
I can take a run, but I want to open it up for you, RG, if you're interested in commenting as well.
I'll let you go first, and then I might have a thought or two.
Great. Well, I think that one thing that's really important to point out is that we want to talk about the strategies and tactics that are being used to yield power by the hard right, and in this case, a lot of these anti-student inclusion groups. And they know what those vehicles are of power, right? And so those spaces where power exists is in education. Educating our youth, right? Like how they're going to think about the world, what they know about the world. Then we know that one of those other places is in politics. And that means actually an elected office if it's nonpartisan. So like some of our school boards or our local city commissions, but also it means our partisan vehicles, our parties. I mean, we see that there is a capture not only of elected office, but of particularly one party in our country where they're trying to take it, right? It's not inherently that way. It's about trying to take it and use it to yield power. And that's even by a few. So even within those institutions, it's actually few people yielding power against the many. And so I actually think, again, I would say engage yourself in those places where there is power being yielded, right? So if it's school, you find the one that speaks to you, the one you can do, because we can only do so much for so long, right? But we find those spaces and we speak to it. And then I think the other piece is we don't back away when we think someone is in disagreement or we know they are. I think we've got to tell those folks that are the ones that were elected because they're part of these far right groups that we don't agree with them. And they have to hear it too, because guess what? The time they spend responding to us is time they are not spent harassing our communities and harming them. So like take up their time, So I think those are some ways. It is not easy. We do have a C4 project where we track electoral extremism and the rhetoric, the themes, and the candidates within that we've been tracking nationally. We can't do it all because there's a little too many. Archie, would you add anything?
So I think that's absolutely excellent. And I would say that, yes, to sort of be engaged as you all are here. But the sort of added to that is the important thing is to also affirm and build affirming spaces and maintain affirming spaces in your communities, because those are the spaces that are definitely under attack. But we know that with affirmation comes power. There's power to develop resiliency. There's power to develop further mobilization. And so, especially in the realm of LGBTQ politics, which is kind of where my specialty has been for my career, it improves the likelihood, affirmation improves the likelihood of folks continuing to engage, continuing to be a part of society. And when you're being told, as not just LGBTQ folks are, but marginalized communities across the board, right, are being told they're not American or that they're not welcome in a space, having a place where they know they are and building that affirming space is one of the best remedies to then also build mobilizing coalitions that can sort of politically, electorally take back these spaces, right, in the next election cycle that have been the source of problems and frustration and bad policy and bigotry.
Well, before we end here, we've got like 3 minutes left. I wanted to highlight the fact that Thursday for Troublemaker Training, we are doing the book banning edition of the Troublemaker Training. So, make sure that you attend if you have not been to a Troublemaker Training before, because it will give you information on how to organize in your communities. And also, make sure that you are checking out our events. Could somebody please drop the event link again, please? Checking out our events and making sure that you're getting the information that you need. I definitely want to thank SPLC for coming tonight. This was hugely important and hugely informative. Do you guys have anything, last minute words that you want to, give us, words of wisdom, marching orders, something of that nature?
I want to thank you for all you do, because sometimes we spend our time in some deep, dark spaces, y'all, but we know that they're small, and everything that you do brings us hope. And we just want to continue to connect with you in your communities. It sounds like so many of you are working locally, and maybe you have a local group that you want to have a short presentation. We have experts in a whole bunch of areas, and we want to make the research work. We want to make it work on the ground. We want to make it work in the policy discussions you're having. We want to make it work for you. So, and quite frankly, we want to be informed by you. So reach out. We'd love to continue this, and this just be an opening of a door to more. So thank you so much.
Again, thank you as well for coming tonight. And thanks everybody for hanging on to the call. We had over 200 and I think 30 people here. So this was really, really good. The chat was on fire. It was going and going and going. So again, thanks everybody for attending and taking time out of a Tuesday evening to get informed. Good night, everyone.